Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Andy, and I'm joined by Elliot.
You're not going to be joined by anybody if you don't cut that out.
I'm not.
Anybody?
How long do you think he could keep it up?
A, too long, and B, don't challenge him because I don't want to find out.
You know what? That's a good call. And once again, our intro is a complete mess. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Oh, fuck.
You better be so glad you're 1,000 miles away from me right now.
Hell yeah.
I'm just gonna send lob shots in your direction.
So we're getting back on that hot goss on the permanent ag movement of the early 20th century.
And that is a string of words which should never exist alongside one another.
Yep, I'm just gonna help everybody out. What's up, everyone? This is the Poor Pro's Almanac, and I'm sorry we're almost 200 episodes in, and we still haven't figured out how an intro works. This is part 2 of agronomy or something I can't pronounce. I don't know. How's that?
Not bad.
God.
So actually, we already did episode 200. So joke's on you.
Wow.
Part 2 of permanent agriculture.
Look at that. So we talked about like the early history of like the development of the permanent agriculture movement, right? So we talked about the development of farmers unions, how basically going into the 20s, it was pretty clear that the ecology was starting to fall apart, right? We had that whole Dust Bowl thing, rivers flooding, general
That little
apocalypse kind of conditions. So the question became like, what was causing everything to suddenly fall apart? What had changed, and what caused people to have this different relationship with the landscape?
Okay, so they fucked around, tried to make things better, and they found out it didn't get better. It, in fact, got exponentially worse.
Tale as old as time.
So a name we haven't brought up yet, Hugh Bennett, who would eventually become the head of the Soil Conservation Service, has a really great quote that I want to highlight right here because it's really apt. So he said, "White men found America a continent more lush and fertile than they had dared imagine. For a century, they had pushed the frontier westward and always found virgin land. Gradually, national land philosophy evolved. It was a philosophy of exploitation, a philosophy that permitted a man in good conscience to destroy his land and move onward to new fertile lands." End quote.
So there was just no reason to really care or like upkeep because it was just always going to be sweet.
I mean, did like people actually think that the resources were limitless?
I think it's very much like the beginning of that like boomer mentality of not my lifetime, not my problem. And this developed into a movement of anti-technology, which would come head to head with the post-World War boom, thanks to the development of the American war machine's excess resources.
Seems like a little bit of a jump.
Yeah, we're going to get there. So first we had talked about the American Farm Bureau Federation, as you probably know it, the AFBF, last episode. They had advocated for a lot of the things we see today, things like extension schools and land-grant colleges and so on. And obviously they were successful in implementing these changes because they exist today. Now, land-grant colleges had existed through the Merrill Act of 1862, and they were expanded in 1890 to force Confederate states to provide equal education for people, regardless of ethnicity. But in 1914, if you recall in the last episode, we saw a lot of these progressive movements kind of fall off because of pricing parity, where people were actually like starting to make money without like having to unionize or anything. During this period, the Smith-Lever Act was put into place, giving the land-grant colleges the resources to bring their research to farmers, as opposed to simply existing as like a destination source for farmers looking for the most cutting-edge research.
So kind of like what we imagine extension schools doing today.
Exactly. So the Smith-Lever Act was really the final piece that made all of these tools get in front of farmers much more effectively, for better or worse.
Yeah, and in all seriousness here, when has the government ever done anything that's made things worse?
Elliot, you're black.
That was sarcasm, Matt.
Oh, okay. British people don't understand sarcasm. Have you been sarcastic this entire time? I thought you really hated Andy.
I was, and I do.
Okay, now I'm even more confused.
While you guys figure that out, there's something that I think that is worth unpacking, and that's the fact that with the Smith-Lever Act, investment in new technologies jumped, despite the fact that yields didn't significantly change for the following few decades. That should ring a bell. While we don't know how much the act influenced purchasing by farmers, the coincidence is kind of suspicious. And unsurprisingly, I'm not the first person to raise this question. While this was going on, folks like Ralph Borsodi, an agrarian theorist and economist, argued that land colleges existed to, in quote, teach the rape of the earth and the destruction of our priceless heritage of land, impoverished our rural communities, wiped out our rural schools, closed our rural churches, destroyed our rural culture, and depopulated the countryside upon which all these depend, end quote.
Period.
Yes. Bold claim, right? In his view, the USDA and the land grant colleges fostered big farming, capital B and F, and were tone deaf to the actual needs of local ecology and those farmers. And this was done by demanding that farmers invest in capital-intensive technologies, monocrops, and the mechanization of farming.
Yeah, and then we wrapped it up in a nice package that looked oddly like an American flag and shipped it around the globe.
I mean, like, tying this into what we've, like, talked about previously with Erna Bennett and Ephraim Hernandez, it all, like, really makes sense how these things played out.
Yeah, and you can start to, like, really tie these dots together, right? And despite this, like, kernel that we've dropped here, we're really not even close to bringing it all together. Now, I wasn't kidding when I said this series was going to be a deep dive that explored how all these things interconnected, and we really still have, like, 100 years until we tie it into modern times. So, like, we've got a ways to go. But before we do that, we're going to take a very quick break. So go listen to this ad. Hopefully it's our buddy Norm. And jump on Patreon to subscribe so you can hear part 3 of this episode right now after you're done with this one. And we'll see you in a minute.
Do you like having a garden?
Yeah.
Do you not like getting dirty?
Yeah.
Great. Neither do we. Introducing Do Nothing Landscaping.
This sounds like just what I'm looking for. Can you take care of my pesky lawn?
Of course. Our lawn care package includes not mowing your lawn and not pulling weeds.
Do you seed and fertilize too?
Nope.
Spray Roundup?
Absolutely not.
So what do you do?
Fuck all. We do absolutely nothing.
Wow, I'm convinced. How do I get started?
Pay us a $50 monthly subscription fee and we'll not mow your lawn, will not rake up leaves, and if you sign up today, you'll be enrolled in our Super VIP privacy program. That means you'll never fucking see us ever again. So stop doing something and start doing nothing today.
While American exceptionalism was a defining trait in American identity in the early 20th century, much like today, during the 1920s and on, that hyper-individuality became basically sacred. The advocates for this new agricultural system knew it would be impossible to present an alternative without addressing the need to find value in interdependence, as opposed to the typical independence we think of today. Notoriously unknown Vice President and Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace advocated for what he called Declaration of Interdependence in 1934, that we were inevitably connected not only to one another, but to the soils, to the farms, and ultimately to the ecology, which was also, as a field of study, gaining more and more recognition. Interdependence was fundamental in this understanding, and you cannot fix the soil without fixing the relationship between agriculture and ecology and people. Russell Lord, who we'll be talking about after this mini-series, this 3-parter, summed it up stating that our soil health was directly linked to our societal health.
So I'm hearing what would later be Bookchin echoing this.
Yeah, although I don't think Bookchin was probably familiar with Russell Lord.
Womp womp.
Womp womp.
And you said Henry Wallace. He's vice president. Was that FDR's VP?
The one and only. He's one of the folks that I do wish we could have done a standalone episode on that didn't make the cut. And oddly enough, Russell Lord, who we'll be talking about in a couple episodes, actually wrote his biography, which is massive. It was 800 pages or something stupid. And I think it speaks to how big of a deal he was outside of his role as vice president. That's almost like an asterisk in, the things that he was responsible for and did, which is, just wild. In terms of his, politics, today he'd be considered probably a democratic socialist. If you wanted to pin him on the scope of things, if we could imagine having that as a vice president today.
Jesus, I mean, American politics really swung pretty far right after World War II.
Yeah, the Red Scare didn't do great things. It wasn't really World War II, it was that Russian Revolution. Honestly, that's probably a talk for another day. To Russell Lord and Henry Wallace's point, they're trying to point to the interconnectedness of every function of our existence. It was understood that everything from ecology and agriculture and construction, engineering, water management, everything you could think of that made humans exist on the earth and made our society work was based on our relationship and our respect for the soil itself. Another author and soil advocate at the time, Stuart Chase, had another really great quote that I wanted to include in this, and that's, "We are all creatures of this earth, and so are part of all our prairies, mountains, rivers, and clouds. Unless we feel this, we may know all the calculus and all the Talmud, but have not learned the first thing of living on this earth." End quote. We're getting real poetic up in here.
I don't think that's true, because one of the first memories that I remember making back when I lived in Texas was learning not to sit in anthills. I know that. Don't sit in active anthills. It's not cool.
Yeah, that is
hold on. You were sitting on an anthill in Texas.
Yeah.
You were king of the hill.
Many times, yes. It's a fluid position, though. You got to fight for it. I brought out the hose. I won.
Yeah, but
there was also no more hill, though.
Between you and an ant, my money's on. Well,
oh, there were hundreds. There were many times where they almost won that war.
And so basically, to get back to our discussion, I guess, the problem was that people understood, who were advocating for this change towards permanent agriculture, was that our system was broken, right? And that the disasters that we would go on to see through the Great Depression and so on were imminent without change. But there was still time to avert a national, if not even global crisis, because our food systems are fundamentally the same across most of the globe at this time. And it's at that point we get to see who would become a very important person in FDR's cabinet, a man named Rexford Tugwell, who was an economist, a soil advocate, and later part of that inner circle.
Man, so I wish the listeners could, listeners, go look up a picture of this guy, Rexford Tugwell. He's, he
looks like he could tug well.
Yeah, he could tug me well anytime.
Let's just say he used a lot of pomade, because I can smell this picture.
Honestly, like, he is way too attractive of a dude to be like a fucking nerd economist who is like, you know what I do in my free time when I'm not doing economics? Dirt research.
Man, I guess he's a little old for me, huh? When was this picture taken?
Sexy Rexy? This is probably the 20s.
Yeah, so probably a little old for me now.
Yeah, well, back then. So let's talk about Sexy Rexy. He advocated for a vision. Basically, what he wanted was that citizens consider themselves not owners of the land, but rather managers of it. And part of their responsibility of being the land's manager was to use it wisely. And that farmers' jobs, people with any land, their job was to make sure that they could pass it on to future managers in which it was as good as or better than when that person found it. Which, like, is I think something a lot of people listening to this would probably agree with. And obviously fundamentally different than how we manage soil today, or had managed soil up until this point.
I'm going to say, like, how are his ideas, like, accepted by the general population, and even more so, I guess?
Foreshadowing.
Those people, I guess you call them the powers that be, but the people of influence who have means, when you say, like, there's no absolute owner, how do people know who to give the money to? That, like, freaks people out, right?
So we're going to talk about this a little bit. So he was like, we got to do something. I'm a sexy economist, and I'm going to tell you how to fix the soil, right? And that urgency found an outlet on March 4th, 1933. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in as the 32nd president of the United States. The future was bold, as they might say. So, like my build-up? Given the fact that, like, we had the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, our rivers were flooding, our pets' heads were falling off.
You did it again.
Yeah. Did I also age myself on Matt again?
No, you used that one a couple episodes ago.
Have I? Oh, sorry. So given this, like, chaos, right? One of FDR's advisors, Sam Rosenman, had advised FDR to build a brain trust. And the idea was get the best academics from across the country who could basically write and guide policy based on the most cutting edge research that would fundamentally save America. Most of the brains trust would be academics from Columbia, such as our boy Sexy Rexy. But we also know like this, our buddy Rex knew folks like J. Russell Smith because, you know, the same circle of folks tend to work in the same economics departments between UPenn and Columbia. There's like a very small group of people that cared about economics and soil for some reason at this time that all got to know each other, and they were doing soil samples together or something. I don't know. Now, another voice, Morris Cook, would be really important in advocating for permanent agriculture and also be a huge player in the electrification of rural America. The last major figure that is worth bringing up with FDR in relation to what we're talking about in the Brain Trust is Hugh Bennett, who we mentioned earlier, became the head of the Soil Conservation Service under FDR. Now, I mentioned Russell Lord earlier. Sorry, I know there's a lot of names. This is it, basically. We mentioned him a few minutes ago, was asked to join the Brains Trust, but he felt he'd be more useful in his role as a journalist and advocate.
Okay, so I didn't realize the U.S. government was getting its teeth wet with sort of how think tanks work and how they can be influenced, because I've heard of the Brain Trust, but I thought it was just predominantly for like economists.
So all these nerds were economists, with the exception of Russell Lord. He was just a legit farmer dude. But like, yeah, for some strange reason, I have no idea why, it seems like every person that was in soil science also happened to be an economist by day. Just like, I don't know. Can't answer it. Can't explain that, as our good buddy Bill O'Reilly once said. Oh, you got that one, Matt? I wasn't too old for that.
No.
I got a giggle. Now, between Tugwell and Henry Wallace, these were basically the two primary voices in Roosevelt's era about the future of agriculture in the United States. They highlighted a lot of the works that we've talked about, J. Russell Smith and John Hershey, who would later guide the Tennessee Valley Authority in their agricultural programs. And it's a really interesting domino effect that kind of takes place simply because Roosevelt wins the election and happens to get tuned into some fucking nerds, basically.
But hang on a minute. The internet told me the elections don't matter.
I mean, it's kind of true. I voted in, I think, 4 elections, and things are definitely not better.
No, yeah, they're pretty bad.
I don't know what you're talking about. Things are great.
So
I'm so happy. It's so warm here.
Is this like 1 point for the internet? Did it get that one right? I don't know.
Oh, so Elliot, when you say you voted in 4 elections, you mean same election, 4 different states, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hell yeah. Fraud that vote.
Listen, I'm just doing what they told me to do at work, okay?
Yeah.
Fraud? First off, the CIA has never told you to do fraud. They tell you to blackmail people.
Yeah, that too.
That's different.
No, the CIA speak to me through my radio static too. They tell me to do the fraud.
They tell you to do the fraud as a way to bait you into getting
Did they
arrested.
not tell you guys to also do the fraud through the radio static?
No, they told me to buy the fertilizer.
They told me to join this podcast.
I mean, you're getting paid to be here from our sponsors.
Double
CIA.
dipping.
Okay, so I'll back up a little bit. What I meant really was that, like, if you care about, like, perennial crops and permanent agriculture, there's a really big win. It was a rare moment in history where the most powerful and beloved president in history could use the absolute collapse of capitalism to basically try out anything he wanted. Unfortunately, it was more capitalism, but it came with a chance of redemption, okay?
So based on how things are looking now and where things are heading, I'm going to go ahead and say that the redemption didn't come and this didn't work.
Isn't this episode called something like The Time America Almost Changed the Global Food System or something like that? Almost?
No,
Elliot?
and Andy, you're getting it mixed up. The Google Doc title for these notes is WW2 Permanent, all one word, Ag Part 2. So, just in case you needed to know that.
Yeah, we came in pretty blind.
That's not clear to you?
Came in pretty blind on this episode. I thought we were going to talk about World War II.
I don't know how that couldn't be more clear to you guys. Come on.
You know what? Our fault.
Yep, I got to spend
Yes.
more time in your
Yes,
head,
it is.
Andy. The one place in the world
about
I
time.
want to be all the time.
This is not a Halloween episode, so we don't need to torture you like that. Come on, Elliot. Ultimately, what was being presented was like an alternative to the hyper-individualist American way that had basically pervaded every facet of society since the Roaring 20s, right? This was for better or worse, and while the idea of planning our agriculture economy wasn't like necessarily new, the scale and the scope of it were. Fundamentally, and this is the part that I think was the biggest catch, was that the idea of permanent agriculture also meant that the diets of Americans would have to shift. There are a million facets to what this would look like, from how to solve the issues of farmers they were dealing with that day because people are losing their farms, to how do we build the tree crops of the future, to how do we develop breeding projects to improve the productivity of the tree crops that they wanted, and everything in between.
So this was the U.S. basically trying to out-Soviet the 5-year plan.
Yeah, and at the risk of sounding a bit racist, I just don't think there is any way we were going to out-Soviet the Soviets and overworking and like work in general.
Man, I got to teach you about slavery, man.
Yeah. I could use a brush up, I guess.
A brush up. I think America at one point did out-Soviet the Soviets in one way. It wasn't a good one, but we did it. Anyway, so the key point was that despite the economic, cultural, and political barriers, FDR's programs backed this vision. The administration founded the Agricultural Adjustment Administration in 1933, which worked to stabilize commodity pricing by buying excess from farmers in order to support the farmers of the present, while also founding the Soil Conservation Service in 1935, all of which helped basically cement the government's role within the food production system within the United States. You likely know the Soil Conservation Service now as the National Resource Conservation Service, or the NRCS, but its initial role was to stop erosion, to restore soils on our farms, and like I said before, Hugh Bennett, who was one of those folks in that brain trust, went on to lead that organization from an early point. I don't think he was the first one, but he was like second maybe. The SCS under Bennett would put together projects like Operation Dust Bowl, which would target specific areas of the country whose soil was no longer capable of growing crops and turning them back into grasslands. Within a year, they'd had over 40,000 farmers working alongside the organization and had put 5.5 million acres under new terraced or contour-listed fields. Within 2 years, despite the continuing dust storms, the amount of what was considered dangerously eroded land had been cut by more than half.
I mean, that's pretty crazy. That's huge.
For America, that is beyond like you would ever expect. And it's worth remembering this is like a weird time in history where, like, how do you put this? Capitalism had to like prove itself, right? Because like the Soviets were kind of proving, at least from a distance, that like an alternative could quickly build up as well. So like it kind of put our way of living, and I'm using that very broadly, right, on trial, because it was like, hey, yeah, I know there's like a handful of people with like a shit ton of money and we've got like all these other problems, but like this thing seems like it might actually be working a little bit better. And before it had been like, well, at least we're not like those other countries. And suddenly the heat was being felt.
And the irony of capitalism needing competition to be good is it's not missed.
No, and also the necessity to have that bottom of the period defined for who's going to actually do the work for both systems is, I guess, interesting too.
Got to do the work. More radically, programs like the Resettlement Administration, which was headed by our man Sexy Rexy.
I don't love it.
He worked to address the plight of tenant farmers whose livelihoods had been destroyed in the Dust Bowl. The RA, the Resettlement Administration, would set up tenant communities which provided basic housing, clean water, and even daycare services for migrant farmers. Stories from these camps range widely, and the use of red baiting, that is, accusing its leaders of being like Marxists or communists or anarchists, led to Sexy Rexy from stepping down and the program being closed a decade later. Many larger farmers despised the RA because it offered an alternative to the harsh management and the less than ideal conditions that migrant farmers had to work in.
Yeah, I feel like the rich hate when they have to keep their workers from not dying.
And if if our listeners want a maybe very romantic account of one of these camps, it features prominently in The Grapes of Wrath as the only place that they were happy. But then Ma famously saying, "You can't edit toilet."
Nice. I was gonna throw that in there, but you all over it, Matt. I'm so proud of you.
You know,
You're a Wrathhead.
I'm a big Steinbecky.
I failed the book.
No.
Failed the book report on that in school. I thought it was about a winery, like / vineyard.
Yeah, I thought about a grape fight.
One of the worst book reports teacher ever read. She was really mad, but sort of impressed at how creative it was. So she was like, "I can't be too mad," you know.
It was like the Little Shop of Horrors, but in a grape vineyard. The Grapes of Wrath.
Yeah, I just watched the movie and read the title and just smash them together.
Hell yeah. All right, so one of my favorite tidbits from American history, like on a bigger scale, actually comes from this time period, and specifically from the Resettlement Administration. And that's in the form of this small town called Arthurdale, West Virginia. Arthurdale is possibly the most well-known project from the Resettlement Administration due to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt's involvement. It was a planned community with a post office and modern plumbing. Now, there were 1930s, that's a big deal. There were no private sector jobs except for one factory which supplied parts to the USPS, and it was quickly attributed to the communist tendencies of the FDR administration, because clearly saving capitalism is communist.
The USPS is communist.
Yes, just the USPS. They've been trying to take down the rest of the government for years.
I support the boys in blue.
The true boys in blue that I support, yes.
They do kind of look like Union soldier uniforms.
That's true.
It's true. And they got those little ergonomic trucks that they drive.
They're so cute. They look like it looks like a cartoon truck. It looks like somebody watched a cartoon.
And they're fucking amazing in the snow, too.
They get around.
Like, they're the utilitarian vehicle. The utilitarian vehicle. Now that we're saying this, actually, yes, they're very decentralized. They're everywhere. They might be communists.
They're ineffective.
Well, yeah.
Or they're so effective that you don't realize it, that they've taken over every town in America.
I'm just wondering where I can get like a fleet of retired post vans.
Are you getting post-pilled, Matt?
We might be spreading the post gospel.
Yes, I love it.
I'm pretty sure you can just ask. I don't think they really I don't think they really drive them into the ground. All right, maybe they do drive them into the ground. I have no idea how much.
Have you ever seen a used one, Elliot? Like a decommissioned mail truck?
No.
Oh my god, they're the same trucks this whole time.
Like communist Cuba. It all ties together,
I'm
guys.
looking for it right now. Keep going.
We're pulling that thread, and it's a juicy one. All right, so this is totally... Well, Elliot, what are you looking up right now?
If I can get a used mail truck.
Yeah.
What's the story? Can we make a used mail hunting truck? That'd be fucking amazing.
These things are tanks. They typically are in service from 24 to 30 years.
Whew.
That sounds pretty goddamn communist to me.
Generally last over 200,000 miles. I'm sure they get a lot more than that.
With all that going, like, that's not highway miles.
Yeah, that's start and stop. I mean, the brakes alone. Yeah. And can you buy them?
Looking.
Okay.
Like, I want to give one a camo paint job, some nice fucking roof racks and rims. Like one of the, I'm just saying, lift it up.
Yeah, your hunting truck has rims.
Yeah, like the spiky rims. Like, you get that thing lifted.
Uh-huh.
Maybe put a trailer hitch on the back so you can like bring a nice trailer with you. Camper.
No, that's a livestock moving van. That's what it's for.
It can do anything. It's utilitarian.
Mm-hmm.
It is the ultimate vehicle. All-wheel, four-wheel drive. Fucking.
They're not. They're rear-wheel drive.
Are they real?
Yeah,
what?
they're rear-wheel drive, and it doesn't look like you can go out and purchase them unless you go to like auction because it's a government thing.
So where are they going then? Because I've never seen a used one.
We're missing the simple answer here. Is when they
Canada
step out to deliver a package, you just need to go and jump in it.
Yep.
That's how to get a used one.
It's the people's vehicle.
Listeners, you heard it here first.
Yeah.
Get in there.
Paw Pro's all
Don't
Mac.
be scared.
Steal a mail van.
Just dump the mail out so you don't get arrested for mail theft.
So what I'm seeing here is I don't think many of them make it to auction. I think they literally get driven into the ground and then probably like parted out, scrapped.
Goddamn efficient communists.
We're just proving our point.
All right, can we get back to Can we get back to Arthur Dale and Sexy Rexy?
So let's talk about Arthur Dale. The idea was that, and this is gonna get some ears to perk up. The vision was that these residents would be self-sufficient through small homestead plots, and organizers actually specifically chose individuals with an agricultural background. The idea was, all right, everyone's got a job, you work part-time, you spend the other part-time where you would be at work, like farming in your backyard, you got a couple acres, something like that. These people all knew how to farm, so theoretically it's like, yeah, they could do this. And it became really quickly obvious that this would never work. By many counts, this program was considered a failure. However, many of the residents that lived there said that was often one of the most valuable, best moments of their lives. And yeah, I just think it's like this really weird, cool piece of history. It's just cool. And like, I think it also like shits on homesteaders. So it's like a win-win.
Yeah. Anytime we're shitting on homesteaders, it is a win.
Wasn't that what happened in the Grapes of Wrath, though?
I thought you didn't read it.
I'm just going on.
You're going to come at me with that book report now?
I don't know. You read it. You tell me what it's about.
But like...
I read it.
That it failed in the Grapes of Wrath?
I read it.
I can see him typing...
asking.
I can see the reflection in his glasses of him typing in Cliff Notes. He doesn't know shit.
Practice? We talking about practice? All right. So anyways... Our buddy Rex was the brains behind the resettlement administration, but he wasn't just behind the scenes. He was also the voice of the projects that weren't like the first wife's pet project, right? He was really effective at this idea of like explaining the complexities behind food systems and ecology. We'll talk about some of my disagreements with him on it, but he was good at this. Before we get there, though, we should probably take like a short break, and Elliot's going to go steal a mail truck.
Hey, we're taking a quick break in the episode to remind you that you can get a whole lot more information from poorproles.com. On our website, we have access to our supplemental reader for the podcast, which provides more depth and context as well as thorough citations for all of the stuff we talk about in the show. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which updates you about limited releases, such as various nursery stock that we sometimes sell through the Poor Proles website, as well as updates about new merch that we have. You can also support the show through that website, poorproles.com, where you have access to our Patreon and our Substack to get early releases for articles and episodes. Now, if you enjoy the show and are just looking for even more audio content, go check out Tomorrow Today, which just wrapped up Season 1, or tune into The Gastropocene, which is a project of myself and Dr. Aisha Khan to discuss the way our diets have driven the Anthropocene and what it looks like to use our diets for good. Now, back to the show.
Okay, so the problem with stealing a mail truck is these things are slow as shit, and it's really hard to get away.
Who's that next to you, Elliot?
That's the mail guy. He was really fast and got back in the truck when I was trying to steal it. He just ran up alongside me.
What's up, dude?
Hey, how's it going?
All right, you should probably leave now, Elliot. All right, so let's get back to our buddy Rexy too sexy.
Dom, if you could just bleep him out every time he says the word sexy, that would be great.
All right, so T Rexy is an interesting figure. You don't like that one, Matt?
Way worse.
You can't please them all. Now, like many people interested in this idea of like sustainable agriculture, he was drawn to soil conservation while teaching in the Northeast. Now, he was considered, let's call him a colorful economics professor at Columbia. Prior to his time at Columbia and before he was a public figure, he also taught at the University of Pennsylvania and overlapped with J. Russell Smith, who also taught at the economics department. And he was a colleague of Scott Nearing, who had, we'll talk about it a bit later. He was one of the leaders of the Back to the Land movement, and that feeds into like the whole permaculture thing and biodynamics and organics and all that stuff. We're going to talk about that later. So these guys had very similar beliefs economically and ecologically. And while J. Russell Smith would capture the minds of future farmers with his words, and Scott Nearing would capture future homesteaders with his homesteadiness. Rex was kind of the voice of the here and the now.
It's so cool when, like, some random area has all these people who later become, like, hugely important, just, like, all gathered together in one spot.
Especially when it's not like New York City or something.
Right. It makes me think of the word gravitas because it makes me think of gravity, but it's also important.
Yeah. Wait, wasn't this in New York City? Wasn't it at Columbia? Oh no, University of Pennsylvania, you said.
Yeah, I mean, some of it was Columbia, but then like University, UPenn was a big one too. There's a big thing with the Quakers. We're going to be talking, I think we did talk about that a bit, but there's just like a lot of Quakers in this space.
When you say Quakers in this space, do you mean like in this, like Pennsylvania, or involved in the big two ecos at this time?
Both, actually. Like Russell's Lord, his parents were Quakers. J. Russell Smith's parents were Quakers. It's just like this running theme. It's an interesting, like, you know, cultural aspect of like valuing
this, like, thread.
Yeah, that I think like plays into this idea of like leaving the land better than how you received it. That I think is like really important and ties into this like really important need for like community and cultural value that kind of like underscores a lot of this, right? And we'll get to that.
Hey, thank a Quaker.
Thank a Quaker. We've had a Quaker on this podcast a while ago.
It's an interesting interview.
It was. Now, Tugwell, our boy, who's the here and the now, he was the face for like, how do we shift our food system so the Dust Bowl never happens again? And part of his ability to pitch wasn't just that he was good about talking about like food systems and stuff, but also like he could say that I'm an economist from some of the best colleges in the United States and the world. He spoke publicly about this need for like a planned, balanced economy in the face of the Great Depression, to the point of actually even explicitly criticizing individualists who confused, and I'm going to use this in quotes from him, identification of capitalism with democracy, which is, I think, a really important nuance that still today is hard to untangle for some people. It was the goal of Tugwell and other economists interested in soil conservation to pair the idea of planned agriculture with democracy, that farmers destroying soils for today's crops were balancing the future costs to the general public, and it was the responsibility of all citizens to consider and care about what was happening to the soils on farms, even if they didn't own the farm. And this was a point that FDR really like loudly advocated.
Well, I mean, like Red Scare time, I understand why people tried to paint him as a communist.
Yeah, and I mean his love of the Soviet Union probably didn't help that. But
well,
yeah,
you know,
usually doesn't. When you're like, listen, I'm not a communist, but
have you seen what these guys are doing over there?
Yeah, not going to win you friends in rich places.
The quickest butt in history.
So to this point, we've kind of focused on like a particular aspect of the work to create these like better, more holistic agricultural systems based on like permanent crops, permanent soils, and even like native crops. However, there was also an important, and this is a very important thread for how homesteading evolves in the future. So like this is something, if you're going to be listening through the series, really worth like paying attention to. There's this movement called the Southern Agrarians. Now, unsurprisingly, the advocacy for this movement stemmed from Southern culture and identity, hence the name, right? And part of what they did was also downplay the role of slavery in the Civil War and instead focused on the inalienable rights of rural Southerners. Gee, don't know who said that later on. Like a whole cultural movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
While they didn't gain any meaningful traction in the public eye, the reverberations of their work is still felt today and is really worth studying.
Let me guess. The problem with America was not enough small rural farmers in the South and too much government regulation.
Get this man a stuffed animal or whatever you win at fucking prizes now at carnivals. What do people win? Like, is it all like plastic now?
I think it's fidget spinners and...
Get this man a fidget spinner.
I would like a fidget spinner, please.
Okay, I'll put one in the mail. Done. Everyone chip in 3 cents. If everyone in this listening to this chipped in like 1/8 of a cent, we could get Elliot a fidget spinner.
I can afford a fidget spinner on my salary.
Sure.
Especially with that big bonus you get.
For the podcast.
Yes.
For the podcast.
For all the resources you gather.
Yes.
Now, the Southern agrarians, they're also known as the Nashville agrarians, and this is important to understand too, is that despite their like very clear ties to like very shitty conservative historical beliefs, they also advocated for a number of progressive policies. This included aggressive inheritance taxes on poor land stewards, bans on speculative land purchases, fines for poor land management. But in all of this, and despite this like very focused, we need to take care of land argument, they also advocated for that land stewardship should be the primary vocation for a majority of the general population.
I mean, I guess that could go either way, really.
I mean, the problem I have with it is you can't tell most people that they need to be farmers or some like adjacent career and then expect everyone to be good at taking care of that land when you made them do something they probably didn't want to do. And I think that like point of a majority of people should be farming is kind of like shitty.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's also been, I don't know if I like totally agree that it has been the major occupation of all humankind until like the last few hundred years, and like with the Industrial Revolution, more people like disconnecting from.
You're getting real Ted Kaczynski in that fucking dark cabin over there.
Yeah, that's not what I'm trying to say, but I think we'd be in a lot better place today if a lot more people were doing this. We're farming and stewarding land.
Yeah, it's fascinating to watch the pendulum swing, not just left and right with politics, but with mass influx into urban areas to chase, factory jobs, or the mass exodus from those cities to get out to the farms. It just, I feel like once it started, like you said, with the Industrial Revolution, we've been swinging back and forth between what's the best move for right now and what does our future look like.
I think there's a nuance to that. Like, more people should be connected to the landscape. I don't think that means we necessarily need more people to be farming.
That's a good point, yeah.
And that can look very differently depending on the ecological conditions and what those sites need for management. Mm-hmm. And that can drive people. Like, I personally, kind of envision like ecology being more of in a future history, more of a church cultural center where it doesn't necessarily, you don't need to be a farmer. You can be going once a week to the local woods and doing your part and managing invasives or seed collecting, plant tree thinning, whatever it might be. And that is a communal cultural piece. But the idea that we all need to be out with fucking hose in the fields.
I'm out with hose in these fields.
That just sounded like a Friday night for me, man.
Hell yeah. It's not necessarily what everyone needs to be doing in order to build that relationship. And for some people that is really satisfying, but I think there's a good portion of humanity that is more capable of providing good things for the general public, doing things that are not that for a majority of their day. And maybe contributing 10%, like the tithe, basically 15% of their time towards like ecological service or food service or whatever the fuck.
Yeah. But I mean, would you call like ecological and food service just like participation in the rural economy? Like, say you're like, I don't know, like processing wool, right? Might not be like a farmer, but you still like performing a very like necessary part of what caring for that ecology might look like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that, but we also have to think about like in the context of what they're talking about, like their vision is small homesteader communities, right? Basically, not like that we find ways that we're passionate about to be connected to our local food system and ecosystem, which is slightly different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this becomes like really obvious because they were like very anti-urban, and they offer interesting positions based on like very weird ways of delivering that content. So like they would write poems about the defense of segregation and also support like separate but equal. And again, this is being the early 20th century. And they would also be like in support of urban Black communities, which they argued were suckered into the shiny lights of industrialism. Yeah, they were just strange. And their advocacy of like this idea of like going back to the land or whatever you want to call it was really an advocacy of a sense of place, right? And that place is very specific and it's very static. And it's basically a time of colonialism and serfdom. And again, one of the things I think is really important is like they're not black and white evil in the sense of being racist in all of the tropes of racism, right? It seems so contradictory to be like, fuck slaves because they disconnected us from the landscape, but also fuck cities because they screwed over black people. Like, that is just such a wildly jarring argument to put those things next to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that like can be really confusing, especially in like our modern world where we tend to paint everything as black and white.
Yeah, I think when you get good at mental gymnastics, you can do a backflip with anything and talk out of both sides of your face. That's just me, though.
Yeah, but for people to actually believe it, it's just like I understand like being like gimmicky and inconsistent, but to like actually like I don't know, it's really interesting. And like I'm gonna like thinking about like Patriot Front, right? And you had that dude Enrique Tarrio or whatever, and you're like, he's Hispanic. How is he the front? How can they be racist if they're
Isn't that the
front
Proud Boys?
or Proud Boys? Yeah. How can they be like this racist white nationalist group if like the face of your organization is Hispanic, right? And like that's a really compelling argument for like white dudes that are sympathetic to that movement, right? Like that is a really easy bait to get them into that, walk them in that door. That's why so many white nationalist organizations so like intimately connected to like marginalized people that have found their way into like marketing themselves as like the face of like what's his name, Andy I'm gonna blank on his last name. Andy Go, is that it?
Yeah, NGO.
Yes, like he's like he supports white nationalism, but he's like Asian, and like that just seems so contradictory. But that's such an important piece of how those organizations can like bypass like a simple reductionist like racist dismissal of their movement. And I think this like is like kind of that predecessor to that, because this is even before like fascism rose. But like that idea of like you don't necessarily need to fully fit into what we believe is like ideal to like find a home in the space makes it much more accessible to a lot more people, not necessarily the people that are being presented as that like, you know, token marginalized person. So yeah, this is totally unrelated to this episode, but I think it's really important to like kind of think about.
Yeah. I'm really glad that these set of episodes are taking the time to pick apart some of this stuff.
It's interesting to me, at least.
Yeah.
Elliot looks like he's about to shoot me. I don't know what's going on over there.
I'm just taking it all in. Taking notes. A lot of names this episode.
A lot of names.
We got any more?
I don't know if we do actually for this one. Actually, yes, we do. All right. So the Nashville Agrarians. So they've got this like hyper individualist homesteading thread, right? And the short of it really is, because we could go deeper into it, is that they're basically unable to like maintain their mixture of politics. And unsurprisingly, many of the original founders either ultimately advocated for fascism on the side of white supremacy, and in Alan Tate's case, for white supremacy but against fascism, or they became like completely disillusioned with agrarianism as like a whole movement. Now, Frank Owsley, who is one of the founding members of the Southern Agrarians, advocated for a return to, and I quote this, modified form of feudal tenure where in theory the king or state has a permanent interest in the land, end quote.
Oh man, that's a rough one.
So yeah, I haven't heard from our friends of monarchism in a while, but here we are. In short, these academics basically were well aware of the inconsistency in this movement, and those inconsistencies eventually forced this movement apart.
Right. I mean, who could have seen or predicted that would happen? I mean, it's not like we're living through that very inconsistency collapsing as we speak this podcast out our mouths.
I mean, everything is fine. I do not know what you're talking about. But it is very interesting that there's this like almost like not royalist, but
Yeah, royalist is the right word.
Threat, because the like southern U.S. has always been closer to the English monarchy, primarily like that side of the English Civil War emigrated to like the south of the United States.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And was also, was the more loyalist faction in the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense if you think about it from like a caste system perspective. Like, it was much more firm and cultural than I think it was in the North.
Mm-hmm.
Even if like the North is the moneyed class or whatever, because the rich industrialists and all that shit. Like, I think culturally speaking, the systems of power were much more similar in the South to England than they were to the North, which was like much more like multicultural. I mentioned one particular figure in the Nashville Agrarians, and that's Alan Tate. And I do want to talk about him for a quick moment. Tate is a uniquely pernicious figure in this conversation. I hinted at it earlier. In his collection of essays, he often comes close to blaming black people for their enslavement. Now, he infers that race, not racism, has allowed for the cancerous growth of capitalism. And usually he's conflating industrialism with capitalism, which I think at that time kind of makes sense because, how capitalism evolved, was very intertwined with very, rigid, vulgar industrialism, right? And in this, he, yearns for days of, the yeoman, the small farmer. And he actually goes on to blame all of this on the enslaved and speaks to this very specific performance and argument, which ties race, class, identity, and anti-industrialism into this one package, which deflects the failures of the system on the system itself, but rather on specific occupants, specifically the enslaved people, for perpetuating the system. Now, we see this really specific and odd strange of anti-race studies and anti-industrialism today kind of in the homesteading community, and this thread of blaming people for the conditions where they exist is really important to pay attention to, and we should be all watching very seriously given the ties between this movement 100 years ago and the current homesteading iteration today. And like I said, we're going to be talking about this later in this series. We're still framing up all of the stuff that gets into it, but we're getting there.
Yeah, you've been saying that for 200 episodes. We're getting there. And I'm just going to throw in a South Park quote because it sounds like this is in the 1800s, and they literally just said to enslaved people that they took our jobs. They took our jobs.
Yeah, that is literally what happened. They said, I'm gonna read it. So you ready? This is Tate's words, not mine. Just for the
Andrew
record,
Tate?
for everyone's. No, it could be. It could be.
This is their much older brother.
Yeah. So he says, the peasant is the soil. The Negro slave was a barrier between the ruling class and the soil.
Damn.
Yeah, that's fucking harsh.
Yeah, the peasant is the soil. Good Lord.
Yeah. So this thread that becomes pronounced with the Nashville Agrarians is imperative to really understanding the complex overlaps between homesteading and white supremacy, anti-globalism, and that really uneasy relationship with capitalism and nationalism. And to the point that I was making about conflating capitalism and industrialism, a really poor understanding of what capitalism is exactly. And again, to the point that we've been making is we have these weird contradictions that keep hitting one another in this space, and that has not gone away yet. And eventually, like the Nashville Agrarians, it's gonna fall apart, and we have to be aware of why that's happening.
Yeah, that's one thing that never really made sense to me is people will say, oh, they'll talk about freedom and free markets and talk about big pharma and big agriculture poisoning us, that doesn't exist because of free markets and greed. And then open borders is the free market for labor, but we got to close the borders. I don't know. It just seems so inconsistent. I can't make heads or tails of it.
Yeah, it's all those people that say it's like corporatism, not capitalism, which just... Anyway, I guess that's why they find their way to fascism eventually, because it solves those inconsistencies. At least in theory.
Exactly. So, I happen to come across this master's thesis from Eric Earnhardt, and it's called Toward an Equitable Agrarian Commonwealth. Yeah, I know. I read this in my spare time. And it addresses this
Dork.
Yeah, it addresses this like dichotomy really like easily. And it's mostly about like now I'm going to say Andrew Tate. Jesus Christ, guys. What the fuck's his name now? It literally can only
Alan Tate.
Jesus Christ.
Sounds like a really boring Tate brother.
Right. That's our brother Alan. He's a fucking farmer. He's a beta male. So he links this distance between master. He talks about in Tate. All right, let me know. I'm just going to quote it. Tate links the distance between master and slave, and therefore between master and land, as the malady of the Southern art, the estrangement from image. The white man got nothing from the Negro, no profound image of himself in terms of the soil, but the Negro, who has long been described as a responsibility, got everything from the white man. And that's a quote inside a quote. Sorry,
Yikes.
I didn't make that clear. While many critics that were sympathetic to the antebellum South believed Southern art suffered because of the moral stain of slavery, Tate offers a counterweight that centers the problems of Southern identity not on the crime of slavery, but rather on the enslaved themselves. Tate writes that critics are fundamentally right in this claim, but for the wrong reason. End quote.
Did he just say the problem wasn't slavery, but that those that had been enslaved survived afterwards?
And I'm not even done. So Tate argues that Southern culture's roots, while closer to the land in spite of the Negro, and that's a quote from Alan Tate, than those of the industrial North, they were not deep enough in the soil to produce great literature. However, Tate argues that, and this is Alan Tate one more time, it was not that slavery was corrupt morally. Societies can bear an amazing amount of corruption and still produce high cultures. Black slavery could not nurture the white man in his own image. End quote. You guys got to have something for that.
I mean, I do. I just don't know if I want to say it in a microphone.
I think if that is what you're saying, then you should absolutely say it in a microphone.
Nah. I better not.
Man,
Matt,
that's
give me something.
No, yeah, it's rough to hear this stuff.
Yeah. This is that darker side of the permanent agriculture movement, the blood and soil side of the American side of like the land conservation movement that, again, it might not have been very important historically at this time.
I don't know. I was just going to say the thing that popped into my head when all this was happening was the stupid meme with the guy riding the bike and he puts the stick in the front tire and then says like stupid whatever.
You're turning into me, Elliot. You're describing memes.
Yeah.
I'm so proud of you.
It's fantastic. And our listeners do love it.
I mean, I just don't know. Like memes have names, but who the fuck names a meme?
Who cares?
I don't know what the name.
Who
I don't know
cares
what the name of the meme is.
The name of a meme
Self-sabotage.
is like a sentence describing it.
Exactly.
The name of the meme is always, you know that meme where.
Yeah. It feels so weird to talk about memes in real life. It's just like,
I don't even, my sense of humor before that was movie quotes. I went from movie quotes to memes. I don't even know where humor came from at this point.
I don't know if that's better.
Humor's a myth.
Yeah.
Sold by big.
It is for you.
Fucking TV.
You unpunny bastard. See?
Yeah.
Easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway,
we've talked about, back to the shittiest Tate. And that's like, that's hard to do. Why are we talking about this? Like, we've been talking about like very like topical historical events and blah, blah, blah. And like this optimistic like tone about like trying to move food systems and ecology to a better place.
Yeah. Last episode, we got to talk about a guy that studied water in his basement in his free time.
Yeah, that was actually like 6 episodes ago. But yeah, we recorded it in like very bastardized order. So
a little peek behind the screen for our listeners.
Yeah. So why are we talking about this and going in such depth and detail about like shitty racist people in the 1930s?
I mean, it's entirely your fault.
Yeah,
that's
it's entirely
why we're
my
here.
fault.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know, Andy. Why?
Why? I really want to just like highlight that there's this like very insidious undercurrent that exists in like this space of like, we need to be in touch with the land. Like it didn't just like a lot of people I think like go to that like blood and soil thing of like the Nazis and so on. And that's true. We had our own brand. And it's really important to understand where it came from and where it went. And we're going to talk about where it went moving forward. Not the next episode, but like a little ways down. And it really is important to like weigh this into like modern discussions of how the erasure of Blackness and other marginalized communities plays out in rural spaces today, or in rural cultural spaces, homesteading spaces, and even in relation to the theft of indigenous practices in order to restore like an authentic domain of the land. That land that in many cases like enslaved people worked. And it would be easy to like just dismiss this as like this happened in history, like everyone was racist in the 30s, like who gives a shit? But actually this movement was reborn in the 80s. Unsurprisingly, it was reborn in the South and focused primarily on like Southern identity and agrarianism. A large part of it's like quasi like progressive part, the kind of anti-capitalist piece that was like really the underpinning of it in a lot of ways, were largely ignored in favor of a defense of a quasi Gilded Age movement that was focused on like culture. So basically going back to that like royalist idea, right? And while this movement had very little mainstream success, its ideological inconsistencies, racial ignorance, and kind of fluidity on a lot of these different arguments is really worth understanding in this agrarian space. And again, how they play into homesteading, white identity, and how that will continue to evolve in the face of increasing extremism and in the face of like these inconsistencies and these juxtapositions of like opposite opinions, right? So like this is a continuing thread that is really worth like highlighting and making this episode extra long just to like drive this point home.
Yeah, I agree.
Did I drive it home?
It's been driven home, yeah. It is the long way of saying this is a time when the South will rise again, but they keep falling. And I'm sure they'll get some momentum again at some point and like try to rise, and then like it'll fall again because it's just a bunch of bullshit.
Just a bunch of bullshit.
Just a bunch of bullshit, man.
You heard it here first.
It is just a bunch of bullshit, according to Elliot.
That could be a good sticker.
That's the sticker, guys?
Just a bunch of bullshit. The
Just a
Portals
bunch of
Almanac.
bullshit.
I mean,
PPA.
that's the best synopsis of our
That's usually what people
podcast.
say about us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Surprisingly accurate. I did that.
Surprisingly. Slimy yet satisfying.
Nope.
Now
we
we're just
had
going
it.
back to movie quotes. At least it's not
Okay,
a
sorry.
description of a meme, I guess. Good job.
I'm growing up by talking about The Lion King. Yeah, so next week's episode, we're going to do the part 3 of the story on permanent ag. We're not going to talk about the Nashville agrarians. That's going to come up again, though, later.
Foreshadowing.
We're going to talk about World War II, the Roosevelt administration, and if you're listening to this right now on wherever you listen to podcasts, part 3 is up on Patreon right now. So if you can't wait, go check it out there. Jump on Substack, read it there. All that cool stuff.
Yeah.
Hell yeah.
And if for anybody that doesn't like listening to our smooth, silky, awesome podcast voices, the Substack is great.
Yeah, guys.
You can the Substack is great. You can read all of our
Matt just hit puberty. I'm so proud of him.
You can read all our content there, and it's a good way to share it for people who maybe don't listen to podcasts or like to read. So that's another.
Which if you're an hour and 10 minutes into this and you're like, wait, I don't listen to podcasts, like I don't know what to tell you, buddy. You do.
Or if you can't
Sorry.
follow our insane banter, it might be easier to read too. There's that.
Mm-hmm.
There's
And
that.
it's free.
No mail truck
what's better than
theft.
free?
We pay
Ice
you
cold.
ice cold freedom in the form of alcohol.
I mean, that's my presidential campaign right there.
Ice cold freedom. Anheuser-Busch.
We're legitimately like 4 elections from that being an actual political slogan.
Oh yeah. I've seen Idiocracy. I'm just gonna change my name to Camacho now.
Oh yeah.
Serving up ice cold freedom with the fucking machine gun.
I mean, you're like halfway there.
Yeah. I'll just keep lifting. I'll get to Terry Crews one of these days. Terry Crews status.
Hell yeah. So yeah, this was a fun and then really dark episode.
Yeah, it
So-
was until the whole walking
Yep.
in the moonlight section with Alan Tate.
Yeah.
It was great.
It was until the Tates always ruin everything is the conclusion.
They
here.
got good cookies.
Yeah. Okay, guys, this has been fun.
Thanks for joining us.
See y'all on the other side.
See you on the next one.
See ya.
Bye.